So the next place you would check for resource activity is what I like to do is use PowerShell, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to this host, and just because I know I'm going to need this, is I'm going to look for a specific share. Here's the sister stuff share, right? I'm interested in this one right here. So I'm going to open up PowerShell, and I'm going to add my snap in. There we go. Add my snap in. Oh, it's important to not have a space there. There we go. That's better. Okay. And then, like every other PowerShell command, most every other PowerShell command for data governance, I want to get the managed host ID for the managed host I'm interested in. So get managed hosts. Okay, I'm going to scroll up. I'm going to get the managed host for that specific resource, which is right here. And I'm going to scroll down. Basically what I'm doing is I'm going to call get resource activity from DGE server, which will get all activities for that resource. And the way I do that is get dash q resource activity, right? And then pass in the managed host ID, which is what I just copied. And the next thing it asks for is resources. So for resources, you can actually get the path directly from the manager here, right? So I can right click on any path in the resource browser, in the manager, and go copy resource path. That's the path that PowerShell, the DGE PowerShell command expects. So I can just click that in there. All right, and then close the quotations. And I believe that is, I can pick a start time, I can pick an end time if I'm interested. I can say only exclude these accounts, etc., etc. But I'm not interested in that. So I'm just going to call get queue resource activity. And look, it's just scrolling through with a whole bunch of information, right? So that tells me that there is activity not only being collected by the agents, it's being sent to the DGE server, to the DGE activity database. Therefore, it's exportable via the DGE PowerShell command. So that makes me feel good because I know at least now that the activity data is there. With it being there, I can actually do perceived owner calculation. Again, that's another troubleshooting area for resource activity. So if you're not sure if resource activity is being collected, just run a perceived owner calculation. Because perceived owner depends on activity being there. If anything comes back, then you have some activities in the activity database. So you're good to go there. The next thing that some people run into is with governed data. Right, so let's log into the web portal, and I'm logged in as a business owner, right? So here I am focused on one of the resources that I own. We have this tab here, recent activity. Here it is right here. And recent activity will show for your governed resource an aggregated list of activities for, by default, the last 7 days. The first time you govern a resource, you'll find that sometimes that list is empty, and that list might stay empty for quite some time. The actual amount of time that it stays empty by default is 24 hours. So every 24 hours, DGE Service will synchronize activities from its activity database into the one identity manager database for governed resources. So that's one of those things you have to be aware of. It's a 24-hour time frame before you'll start to see information in there. Of course, that can be adjusted. So on the server side, we have a configuration file right there, .datagovernanceedition.service.exe.config. And within that is a setting here. And we're going to find that. Here it is right here. I'm glad it was the first one I found. Perceived ownership calc updates refresh interval minutes. That's a great phrase, but that is the key that determines how often activities are synchronized from DGE activity database to one for governed data. And you can see the default value is 1,444 minutes, which means every day. What I've done is because I want that activity synchronized fast. Of course, I'm in a demo situation here and I want to show the activity. I've actually set that value to 5. So every 5 minutes, anytime activity, every 5 minutes, DGE will kick in and grab the latest activities for that governed resource and then store them in the QAM tables for QAM-DUG, the QAM-DUG tables that aggregate this activity. So editing that setting is what's going to get you up and running and get the data into the database, into the web portal fast, right? So that's one of those common questions that we get asked. So now I'm going to talk about self-service. There's some key troubleshooting areas of self-service. So in the request service catalog here, as an end user, I can go in and I can request access to resources, right? So I can request access to this resource right here. I can suggest or I can request either read or write access, etc. And the next step goes to the business owner to make a decision. So when I request this resource, right, go OK, and then submit. So at that point, it goes off into the Identity Manager database as a request. It's going to get executed. Now, what gets executed at that point is it's important to know where that request goes. Above and beyond actually going into the Identity Manager database, there's also a connection that needs to be there from the job service with the data governance connector, and I'm going to show that. So in the designer, we have to have a job service that's set up as data governance connector. And without at least one job service set as that, the self-service workflow for requesting access to resources, it just won't work. You need that job service set up as data governance connector. That service needs to be running as an account that has the data governance roles associated with an employee that has the data governance roles, because that job service is going to talk to DGE in the request to say, please give me the correct group to fulfill the request, right? So it's very important that you have that job service. That's very key there. When you have that set up, if there's any issues with groups aren't being returned, then the data governance log file obviously is something you want to look at. Again, this is kind of your key log file for finding out when things are going wrong, especially around self-service, because this log file will tell you if certain groups were excluded from the calculation and for what reasons. For example, let's say I'm requesting access to a resource and I'm requesting read access. Well, the calculation of best fit group is going to exclude groups that provide more than read access, like modify full control, of course, is going to be excluded. And if you have any groups set up, configured that you never want them returned from self-service, it's going to show in the log. So there's going to be log entries on the DGE server side that will tell you these things. The other log file that's interesting, of course, is the job service log. So the job service that's set up as data governance connector, if there's any issues in the connection between that job service and the DGE service, or if no groups are returned from the DGE service, then there may be an indication within the job service log as to why. So of course, checking that job service log is very important. And then the actual script that gets called to actually get the best fit groups, we have this vi_person_wants_org _prefill IT shop org final for group. Again, we have this great name for a script, but you can actually see the script and you can follow through the logic to see what's actually happening when this self-service takes place, right? From the perspective of the one side. So this is the code that's checking, is this request valid? Is the path valid? Is the person allowed to actually request access to things, etc., etc. There's a whole bunch of logic in here that could be useful in diagnosing what's going wrong. Another thing that's very common is whether or not the published resource is set to be looking at the share security or the folder security, right? So we can look at that in the object browser. So here's my governed resource. We're in the object browser, QAMDug, and I've found my QAMDug, my governed resource that I'm interested in. And we have this property here called use folder for IT shop that's actually set to true, right? So it's published to the IT shop. You can see that right here is for IT shop is true, and use folder for IT shop is true as well. And what that means is that for self-service operations, the DGE service, when it gets a request to find the best fit group to fulfill a request, it's going to look at the folder security. Is folder means use these permissions. Don't use the share permissions, right? Here it would look at, if that was set to false, it would look at domain admins and everyone. Obviously, there's nothing in there interesting because I don't set my share permissions in this particular case to provide access, right? It's the folder permissions that I'm interested in, because here I have a read group, the domain local, the brother, here's the group for Matt's sisters. These are the groups that I use to provide access, and I use them on the folder. So understanding what the value of that property is, and here we'll go back to the object browser again, use folder for IT shop, true, which is the default value when you publish a share in data governance. So understanding that that's the default. If you're not seeing any groups coming back and you use share security, then that's probably a good indication of what's going wrong. So again, these are just some common troubleshooting areas around activity and self-service that have snagged a few people in the past. So there you go, and hopefully these help you move along in your data governance deployment.